Please silence in the room. Silence in the room. If you like to talk, you just can open the door and talk outside, or come and sit down here and listen, because this is really going to be very interesting and very helpful, especially for those of you who use AI. AI, the frontier and conundrum. So to look where the legal boundaries are. Is it a minefield or can it help? How is it with the copyrights? How far can we go with AI? And I'm really glad to see him again on stage. He was here yesterday twice. He's a lawyer. He was awarded us the Attorney of the Year, and he was quoted many times in the Hollywood Reporter, partner at Donaldson, Callif. Please welcome Chris Perez from the USA. And this is a conversation. This is a one-to-one talk, and this talk is led by the actor, screenwriter, and producer Rodney Charles. Your stage.
Hello. Hello and good afternoon, I believe it is now, everyone. Thank you for being here. Right, it gives me great pleasure, and that I can say honestly, to be here with Chris Perez. Beyond the fact that we've known each other for some time, your legal expertise is invaluable. And if I could just take a moment to sort of indulge myself in terms of just a couple things. Chris is extraordinary in this regard. The company that he works for in Los Angeles, Donaldson, Callif, and Perez, at which he's a partner, focuses primarily on independent filmmakers. And what that, as opposed to the studios per se, and what that gives us the opportunity to do is ask questions to Chris, who has a breadth of international independent filmmakers, and he is the person who legally irons out a lot of the problems that we find ourselves in after we have made a film, or he eliminates a lot of the problems if we consult him ahead of time. So there is this component. And I think when it comes to the AI space, which is the purpose of our conversation, the AI frontier and conundrum, a candid look at copyright and legal minefields, who owns what, I think is appropriate. Chris, can you sort of tell me, when did AI first come to your recognition, and what were the initial impacts from the artificial intelligence space?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it was probably around 10 or 15 years ago when people started to use the term, at least in the fields that I was in film and television. And we all looked at it with kind of a sense of humor because it didn't look good, right? People weren't using it in the way that they do today. And frankly, people weren't as concerned about it as they are today because of the way it was used, and it wasn't a great substitute. I remember the first film where it really came on the map was, there was a documentary about Anthony Bourdain, where after the fact, they used his voice, they used AI to essentially replicate his voice reading from one of his diaries. And I think the filmmakers in that situation did as much as they thought that they could in terms of doing the right thing, but audiences, frankly, were thrown off by it. That was the first time that people said, I don't know how I feel about this, because we know he's gone, we know that's not his voice, yet it sounds exactly like him. So if this can happen, what else is going on behind the scenes? And that was the first time where I think there was a legal question, but just as important alongside of it, there was the ethical question, which as attorneys we're dealing with together at the same time.
Gotcha. And so there is a question that I have that you're the perfect person to pose this to, because your firm has, well, quite literally written the book on fair use. And so when it comes to artificial intelligence, well, let's back into it this way. Fair use, just to make it, no, let me have you explain what fair use is.
Right, so we touched on this a little bit yesterday, but copyright law in most countries vests all of the exclusive rights to exploit a creative work in the author, and that's a great thing, right? It used to actually be the other way around. Back in the days of the printing press, it was the printing presses and the major copiers of works who had all of the control over works, and artists would be at the behest of these companies. In the late 1700s, it flipped. Now authors are in control of their works, and that's great. But in order for us to have a free society in which we can comment on and criticize other people's works, and we can make parodies and satires and other works that take bits and pieces from other works, we need fair use, which is an exception that allows a user to use bits and pieces from copyrighted works without permission. So we might be asking, how is this relevant to AI? I think there's two main questions, right? One is when a learning machine, an LLM, ingests materials for the purpose of training that learning model in order to create something and to have an output. There's two processes. There's one of grabbing all of that material. What are the implications of that? And then what about what comes out, right? And that's what the courts are dealing with. Is it an infringement of all these people's works that are grabbed up online, out in the ether, in order to train the model, which is undecided? That's the answer to the question. The U.S. Copyright Office has not decided that yet. They're going to decide in the next couple months. And then the other question is, what about the output? And I think they're both relatively undecided, but when you're working with millions of works going into a model and then outputting something that's completely different, most people would say, well, that's fair use because it's not recognizable as anything else that comes out. That being said, there's tremendous risk involved as a filmmaker in using those programs where you're grabbing from unlicensed materials and unlicensed libraries.
So it is a confusing landscape for so many reasons, least of which there doesn't seem to be a very clear legal framework for the use of artificial intelligence, and certainly from an international perspective. And we throw the word AI around, and I just kind of want to compartmentalize this a little bit, if I could, with you, Chris. Because on the one hand, generally when we're talking AI, we're talking about generative AI here. But there is the language models, the use of voices. You've just given the example with Anthony Bourdain. And then you have the visual kind of, to simplify it, we can just say like utilizing the likeness of an individual, etc. Can you tell me a little bit about what are the different elements of artificial generative AI that have surfaced that you've had to deal with in terms of just compartmentalizing them, and if possible, an example, as in the voice case, for example?
Yeah, and I briefly mentioned this yesterday, but one that comes up is I represent a lot of documentary filmmakers, and some of whom do true crime documentaries. And if they're doing recreations, one example might be you're talking about a murderer in California, and you want to have a recreation of a scene of the scene of the crime, the bloody bed, the pillow. That's something that traditionally you have to hire a crew, go in at night, shoot, cost tens of thousands of dollars, maybe more. And now you can use a program to essentially create that for a fraction of the cost, and people are already doing it. And I think that beside the market factors, because that results in a lot of job loss, reduction in staff, I think the other thing that really needs to be discussed is the ethics of transparency, right? So as a viewer, as a filmmaker, are you communicating to the viewer that this is actually occurring? And we're just at the beginning of having this conversation as in an industry about how to make it clear when certain AI tools are used, because some people are doing it, some people are saying doing that, with a lower third, others are putting it in the end credits, other filmmakers are not saying it at all. And I do think that as an industry we need to figure that out.
Where are we, Chris, legally in the spectrum of things in terms of, I know we're no longer exactly in the wild, wild west stage of the AI, utilization of AI, but where do we really stand legally? And maybe, ultimately, I think as filmmakers, no matter where we are, North America, as far as distribution, and certainly all of the companies that come from North America, that's the holy grail of distribution. So one way or another, it feels as though we're impacted by the American standard when it comes to the legal implications. So as an attorney based in the US, can you kind of tell me where do things stand currently from a legal perspective, and so we can get a sense of what to look out for in terms of...
Yeah, so it's for not all generative AI models are created equal, right? So if you're the models that most of us are familiar with, they're grabbing from material that is unlicensed, right? And so the output, there's no permission for that. And you have to tread carefully with that because the law is not settled on that. It could go in one direction. It could say, we're going to look at this on a case-by-case basis. Does this particular footage look like this footage? Does this painting that you created look like this painting? And how are you using it in a new work, right? So it's case-by-case. On the other hand, there are generative AI models that are pulling from licensed libraries. So Adobe has one of these. There's lots of companies that are doing these. My understanding is that a lot of these are not as convincing, right? Because they're working from smaller libraries, but at the same time, you can work with a company like Adobe and have representations and warranties on there and saying, we have the right to use this and therefore you have the right to use it. I actually thought, we had a panel about co-productions. Yes, and one piece of advice that I would mention to people that it's very rarely making its way into contracts yet, but it will in the near future, is just understanding if you're about to enter into an agreement with a co-production partner, do we know if they're using AI? We're not always asking the questions, right? I just did a deal with a company in Denmark where they're being engaged to essentially do the music for a film, right? Are they using AI? We don't know, right? So that you have to have the conversation, and you also have to put something in the agreement that if you're using AI, you represent that you've gotten all the permissions for it. And I don't think those conversations are always happening yet. If you hire a writer, do you have something in the contract that says you created this, not a machine?
So is there a sort of nightmare scenario where we can find ourselves kind of showing up with finalized content, and because of some change or new ruling in the law, that we can find ourselves with content that may not be appropriate for distribution?
Yes. So a nightmare scenario is you hire a writer who writes this wonderful story, you make the film that's based on the screenplay, and on the basis of that, your distributor would like to make a sequel, but it turns out that your writer didn't write that screenplay. They just put a machine wrote it. And therefore, the machine is not a person under the law, and you don't have copyright protection. So anybody out there who looks at that machine-written screenplay can then infringe it. And all of a sudden, your distributor doesn't have a protected right to create all of these derivative works. So works that have some kind of human creation element, those will be protected by copyright, but purely AI created works will not. And so if you have a writer who writes something, or doesn't write it, but uses an AI program to create it, that's a problem.
That is a very valuable piece of information, and I think that I'll be sharing that information because I think it will impact a lot of individuals who seem to think that just utilizing generative AI to create content is the way to go. Now, I understand, of course, that you deal largely with directors and producers, but I'm kind of wanting to just break this field down a little bit in terms of how AI impacts the sort of almost the value chain. I'll limit it, of course, but the value chain within the film industry. You have your acting talent who are going to be impacted quite legally, and I know that the Screen Actors Guild are deep in conversations and legislation based upon voice and likeness for actors. You have, excuse me, you have your writers and their particular concerns as far as potentially having their content, human-created content, licensed, purchased, whatever it is, and then augmented by AI. There are all these sorts of things. And then, of course, you have ultimately producers and even directors who are functioning in the space and utilizing different AI tools. Can you speak a little bit to those differing spaces to the degree that you've encountered any specific kind of concerns or issues in those spaces?
Sure. Well, the union strikes had to happen. They had to happen for a number of reasons, but this issue was probably the most important from a long-term perspective because they had to protect. If they didn't do that, it would be very, very easy to cut people, the actors, out of films, right? And not just that, but hey, we hired you to shoot for 10 days, but we don't need you to come back. We're not going to hire you for the next 2 days because we can just use what we shot, put it into an AI model, and do a reshoot that way. And so somebody loses 2 days of work, right? Or somebody takes that work and then puts it in a different work, and all of a sudden the cat's out of the bag, right? So I think with every profession in the industry, that conversation is going to happen, right? Where the core value of whatever that profession is protected, and then the train has left the station with AI. It's not stopping. So using programs to enhance what is essentially a human-created piece of work, that is, I think, the goal across the industry, hopefully, for most people. And I think we're just not there yet. But with respect to actors and writers, those new deals, AI was very, very much front and center for both of those negotiations.
That's important to know. I'm sorry, Chris, but I've been given a very clear and definitive signal that we're out of time. This is a conversation that obviously could keep going and needs to be developed, and we'd love to have you back at some point to further visit this conversation as things develop. But as it stands right now, ladies and gentlemen, can you put your hands together in thanking Chris Perez?
Thanks, Rodney.